Hello again, everybody. Welcome back from spring break. I hope everybody enjoyed your week off. Today we're going to talk about fresh water. In particular, we're going to touch on the water cycle. We're going to talk about watersheds, and we're going to wrap up with talking about rivers and how rivers, how we sort of categorize them, I guess we could say. So let's start off with just a real quick review of the water cycle, which is something you guys are probably already familiar with, but just to refresh your memory. So we have the different stages in the water cycle, right? If we start off with evaporation, evaporation being the water vapor coming from oceans, lakes, and streams, the water vapor rising up through the air. There's another way that water vapor rises up, another place that it comes from, and that's plants. And you may or may not know about this step. This is called transpiration. So transpiration is just that water vapor coming from plants. Once that water evaporates and it collects up in the atmosphere, we know that it forms clouds, and that process is condensation. So that's when all of those water droplets start to come together to form clouds. And eventually those clouds get full. They can't hold any more water droplets, so those water droplets have to go somewhere, and they fall back down to earth in the form of precipitation. And that precipitation could be rain, sleet, snow, hail. There's lots of different ways that that water can fall back down to earth. Once it falls back down to earth, it's going to run across the surface in streams and rivers, and we call that surface runoff. So that where it's actually running across the surface is surface runoff. And then some of it does end up going underground, and the water that's underground is actually referred to as groundwater. So that's just a basic review of the water cycle, just to kind of refresh your memory a little bit on that. So today in particular, we're talking about the water on the surface. So we're going to start off talking about watersheds. So watersheds are simply the land that water flows across or through on its way to a common stream, lake, or wetland. Something maybe even as small as a pond. Okay, so we live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So any water that falls on the ground in our area is eventually going to end up in the Chesapeake Bay, because that's what this is referring to. It's where all of the water ends up going. Watersheds are divided by what are called divides, and divides are just simply areas of higher elevation that separate watersheds. So these could be mountain ranges or just hills, just anything that's going to separate the direction that the water flows. So again, a watershed is just the land that the water flows across, and watersheds are divided by what we call divides. Now, Virginia does have 9 major watersheds, and they're kind of broken up into 3 groups. So the river watersheds, those are the 9. So there's 9 rivers, and then 3 larger bodies of water that they flow into. So the Chesapeake Bay watershed includes the river watersheds of the James, the York, the Potomac, and the Rappahannock. The Gulf of Mexico watershed includes the rivers, the New River, the Big Sandy River, and the Tennessee rivers. And of course, for the Gulf of Mexico, those actually first go to the Mississippi River, and then they dump into the Gulf of Mexico. And then lastly, the Albemarle Sound, which is down in North Carolina. The Albemarle Sound watershed includes the Roanoke and the Chowan rivers. So 3 big chunks, but 9 separate rivers that we have watersheds for. The Chesapeake Bay is the most productive watershed in Virginia, so there's a lot going on. The Chesapeake Bay is an estuary, so it's a place where fresh water from the rivers mixes with salt water from the ocean. And there's a lot. We rely on the Chesapeake Bay actually for a lot, as far as fishing and recreation and just all kinds of stuff, shipping. So it's a very important body of water for us in this area. And all the way up through it, actually, the Chesapeake Bay watershed stretches all the way up into Pennsylvania and New York. You can see in this picture here what we're talking about as far as all of this land. Anything, any water that falls on any of this land that's shown in this map is going to end up in the Chesapeake Bay. The Mississippi River watershed is actually the largest watershed in the United States. So you can kind of see all of the different places in this map where water that comes from any of this land is going to end up in the Mississippi River. And ultimately, the Mississippi River drains into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's a very big, big land mass that is covered by this watershed. It's very important. Now let's talk a little bit about river development. There are 3 stages in the development of a river, and these have to do with distance from the source, not the actual age, okay? So when we say young, mature, and old, we're not saying that like, okay, well, this river is older than this other river, and as far as age goes, it's more to do with the distance from the source. So each river is going to actually have places along the river that might be in these different stages, and they're all the same river. It's just it has to do with the distance from the source of where the water is coming from, and each stage does have very specific characteristics. So the first stage is the young stage, and this is the closest to the source. So the source is probably a spring or something like that up in the mountains, and it's up in the mountains, so the gradient of the land, it's very steep, so the water is going to be very quick moving. The young stage is going to have V-shaped valleys. It's going to create these V-shaped valleys. So the actual river valley itself, where the water is curving through, cutting through the land, is going to be in the shape of a V. You're going to find a lot of waterfalls. Again, this is going to be in the mountains, so there's going to be a lot of changes in the elevation and drop-offs and that kind of stuff. So you can end up with a lot of waterfalls and rapids and that kind of stuff. Then you get to the mature stage, and this is farther from the source. The land is going to be more flat, so the water is going to slow down. And what's going to end up happening is the river is going to want to kind of take the path of least resistance in a way, if you want to think about it that way. And what can happen is the water is going to start to curve. The river is going to start to form these curves, and these curves are called meanders. And so that is a big characteristic of the mature stage of rivers, is these meanders. The water in the meanders is moving faster on the outside of the curve and moving slower on the inside of the curve. So there's going to be erosion happening on the outside of the curve, deposition happening on the inside of the curve. And then finally we get to the old stage, and what happens with the old stage is the water is very slow moving. It's farthest from the source, and we get what's called oxbow lakes. So you remember those meanders I just mentioned? Well, sometimes what happens is those meanders can actually get cut off, and they form these oxbow lakes. And you can see that in this top picture, these curvy looking lakes that are here. Those used to be connected to the river, but instead what has happened is, like I said, the river wants to take the path of least resistance. So sometimes those meanders can get super curvy and actually meet back up and kind of cut off part of the river, and that forms those oxbow lakes. You're going to have floodplains on either side of the river that can, when the river is in flood stage, those floodplains can be covered with water. Excuse me. And you're also going to end up with deltas and alluvial fans. And so these are depositional features that happen when a river meets a larger body of water and it deposits all that sediment that it's been carrying. A delta is formed when the sediment gets dumped in the water, and an alluvial fan forms when the sediment gets dumped on land. So those are just depositional features that form at the end of the rivers. Okay, so that's all I have for you for today as far as these the surface water, but we will continue talking about some of this stuff as the weeks move on. I hope you guys are doing well, and again, I hope you enjoyed your spring break.